Hello, everyone. Mike Vlock here. What I wanted to do for the next few minutes is look at a very important psalm, which is Psalm 2. And then in particular, we're going to look significantly at verses 8 and 9. And so we're going to talk about those verses in particular. We're not going to explain the whole psalm in detail, but we do want to read the psalm to set up for what is going to be discussed in verses 8 and 9. And then we're actually going to go back and look at a couple older Old Testament texts that have connections with Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9. And then we're going to go to the New Testament to talk about some key passages that really link Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9 with the second coming of Christ. So we're going to look at some intertextual issues and theological issues that are related to Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9, and hopefully have a better understanding of what God is accomplishing in the world as a result of looking at these important verses. So let's go ahead and call this message Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9, and the second coming of Jesus. So when we are dealing with Psalm 2, we are dealing with the Psalm of David. We're told in Acts 4 specifically that David is the author of the psalm. And what we are going to see here with this setting are really the nations and the rulers of the earth being very upset with the Lord and with his Messiah. So the psalm begins, "Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us." So as this psalm begins, you see that you really have a rebellious planet Earth. You have the leaders of the earth, the nations of the earth, the peoples. They're supposed to be serving God. We know that God is the creator. Everyone owes their allegiance to the creator. But we're seeing the nations in an uproar. We're seeing the peoples not wanting anything to do with God. They don't want anything to do with his Messiah. They don't want anything to do with what God expects from them. And they are just defiant. They are rebellious. They just don't want anything to do with God or anything that he requires. Now, in verse 4, we're told that he who sits in the heavens laughs. And so you actually have God up in heaven laughing at the rebellion that is taking place on earth. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger. So he laughs, and then he sets things down by speaking in anger. And it also says, and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And so the Lord is going to deal with this rebellion, and he will make a statement that he is establishing his king, which is his Messiah, and it's upon Zion, my holy mountain. There's all kinds of passages in the scripture that talk about that. David's throne being in Jerusalem, that there is going to be an earthly kingdom of the Messiah from Jerusalem, will be over Israel, will be over the nations. And basically, God is meeting this rebellion by saying, I will establish my king upon Zion, my holy mountain in Jerusalem, and he will reign in the realm of where the rebellion is taking place. Now, when you come to verse 7, we're told, I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. And he said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. So we're seeing God the Father, the Lord, calling the Messiah his son. Now that leads us to verses 8 and 9, which is the emphasis of this message. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth is your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall shatter them like earthenware. Now, we're going to talk about the implications of those verses here shortly. But basically, what you have here is the Lord telling the Messiah, you're going to rule in the realm of the rebellion. You will rule on earth. I'm going to give you the nations. I'm going to give you every inch of planet Earth, and you're going to rule over it all. Now, what should be the proper response from the nations and the peoples of the earth is what follows in verse 10 and following. Now, therefore, O king, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, or kiss the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. And how blessed are all who take refuge in him. So that's the proper response that should take place from the nations, is God will establish his king upon the earth and he will rule the nations. So the wisest thing to do is to run to that, to do homage to the Son, to kiss the Son, to get in line with God, with God's plans. And so what we see here with the implications of Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9, are this: God will give the Messiah the nations as an inheritance. And so the nations of the earth are going to belong to the Messiah. Secondly, the Messiah will possess the entire earth. There will not be 1 inch of this planet that is not under the rule of the Messiah. And we also see, thirdly, that the Messiah will break and rule the nations with a rod of iron. This will be a dominating reign that everyone acknowledges, where the Messiah has total control over the earth and the nations at this particular time. Now, what I wanted to do quickly here was talk about the issue of Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9 with prior revelation. And I wanted to make reference to Genesis 49, 8 to 10, and then Numbers 24, 17 to 18, because one of the things that we want to do when we're looking at passages is pay attention to the theology that comes before, and then the theology as it comes from Scripture that comes after a particular passage. So when we look at prior revelation here, I do think that Genesis 49, 8 to 10 is significant. In Genesis 49, you have Jacob who's giving messages to his 12 sons who represent the 12 tribes of Israel. When he comes to Judah, he's dealing with Judah in chapter 49, verses 8 to 12. We're not covering all of those verses, but we are told in Genesis 49:10 that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. So when we're dealing with the scepter, we're dealing with a warrior aspect, a kingly aspect here. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. So the king, the Messiah, the ruler is going to come through Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. Now, Shiloh, as the translation here has it, New American Standard has that as like almost as a title for the Messiah. Some translations have, and I think this is probably better, he to whom it belongs, but either way, it's a reference to the Messiah. So there's going to be this Messiah, this Shiloh, this he to whom it belongs. And notice, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So when you put this together, we see, when we look at the implications here, what we're seeing is there will be a Messiah from Israel who will rule over the peoples of the earth. And that's very similar to the theology of Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9. Numbers 24, verses 17 to 18, this is also a messianic passage. So what you have here is a prophecy. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. So this is forecasting the Messiah into the future. A star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel. Again, it has connections back to Genesis 49:10. A scepter shall rise from Israel and shall crush through the forehead of Moab and tear down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be a possession. Seir, its enemies, also will be a possession, while Israel performs valiantly. Now, when you look at the implications here, what are we seeing from this here? Implications from Numbers 24, 17 to 18, that there will be a Messiah from Israel who will rule the nations of the earth. And even that possession language, very similar to what we see in Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9. So really, we're seeing a very close connection here between the message of Psalm 2, 8 and 9 with two very key passages that actually came before that. And really what I think we're seeing is later writers of Scripture will rely literally upon the earlier predictions and prophecies of other writers. So there's a connection between Genesis 49:10 and then Numbers 24, 17 to 18. And then there's a connection with Psalm 2, 8 and 9. And if you stop at that point, and we're not just going to stop there because we're going to continue, but you get this multiple times over and over again, that there is going to be a special person, a Messiah from Israel. He is going to rule over the nations, and he's going to rule over the entire earth. Now, when we come to the New Testament, what do we see? I think we're going to see a lot of continuity here with this particular message. Right? In Revelation 12:5, you have this scene in Revelation 12. We're not going to read and explain the whole entire chapter here, but I wanted to draw your attention to verse 5 eventually. But you have this great sign. It appears in heaven. There's a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. On her head, a crown of 12 stars. She was with child. She cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And then it talks about a red dragon, which seems to be a reference to Satan. And when you come to verse 5, there's a reference to Jesus here that I think is significant. And we're told that this woman, which is probably a reference to Israel, that she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is, now notice what we have here. We have a reliance on Psalm 2:9 at this point, that there is this child who is what? To rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And then her child was caught up to God and to his throne. But I wanted to focus on that middle part there, that this child, who we believe has connections with Jesus, is one who is what? He is going to rule all the nations, and it's with a rod of iron. Now, most Bibles, if they're tracking the connections with the Old Testament, will give a link there. They'll show, or they'll make a note that this has a strong connection to Psalm 2:9. And what did Psalm 2:9 say? That there was going to be this special person, this Messiah figure, who is going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. And I would say here, Revelation is written in the 90s, and it is, according to the book of Revelation, it is a prophecy. Yes, there's symbols which are going to convey a lot of the prophetic elements, but it is a prophecy. And we see here that this child, who is probably a reference to Christ, is one who's going to rule all the nations with the rod of iron. So that Psalm 2:9 expectation of the Messiah ruling the nations of the earth with a rod of iron is still, yet that expectation still exists in the New Testament. It's showing up in the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. And there's still that anticipation, which I think is referring to the second coming of Jesus. Now, when we come to Revelation 19:15, this is also very significant. And what we're seeing here is, I'll read the verse and then we'll talk about the context. So in Revelation 19:15, we're seeing that from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God, the Almighty. So you have a reference to this individual, which I think is clearly Jesus at his second coming, talking about he may strike down the nations, he will rule them with a rod of iron. Now, I just wanted to point this out here. I make reference on the slide to Revelation 19:11-21, and we're not going to read all of this here, but I just wanted to place this into context, that the statement in verse 15 that he will strike down the nations and he will rule them with the rod of iron is coming in the context of Revelation 19:11 and following, which is a description of the second coming of Christ. So verse 11 of Revelation 19 says, I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. This is a reference to Jesus at his second coming. And then it's within that we're told that he's going to strike down the nations and he will rule them with a rod of iron. Now, after that, you're going to see that he deals with the beast and the kings of the earth and the armies that are assembled against him. He deals with the beast. He deals with the false prophet. The next chapter, Revelation 20, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this here, but it talks about reigning with Christ for 1,000 years. So I just wanted to point out the context. Revelation 19:11 through the end of the chapter is talking about the second coming of Jesus. And then Revelation 20 talks about the kingdom of the Messiah of Jesus for 1,000 years before the eternal state starts. So now coming back to this, Revelation 19:15. So we wanted to notice here that in the context of Jesus' second coming, we get a reference to Psalm 2:9, that he may strike down the nations and he will rule them with a rod of iron. So that is a quotation of Psalm 2:9. And it's very important to know that this is placed in a future context. Notice there's the reference to he will rule them with a rod of iron. So Revelation 19 is talking about something that is future from our standpoint. It is talking about the second coming of Christ to earth. And in this scene that is being pictured, which is future from our context, we're told that this Jesus will rule them with a rod of iron. It's at that time he will strike down the nations. So we can rightly conclude that the Psalm 2, verse 9, and we could even include verse 8, where it talks about the possession of the earth, that awaits the second coming of Christ. So it's very significant here that as we connect the dots, that the Psalm 2, we could even say verses 8 and 9, reign comes with Jesus's return to earth. And then I wanted to go to another passage that talks about the Psalm 2:9. And this is in Revelation 2, verses 26 to 27. So Jesus is giving a message to the church at Thyatira. Again, the pattern is you have these 7 churches that are receiving messages from Jesus, and then it usually ends in prophetic eschatological rewards that are to come, which most of them seem to would involve the church as a whole. But we're told in Revelation 2, 26 to 27. So as Jesus speaks to the church, and again, this is in the time of the 90s AD, and the churches are facing persecution and all kinds of trials. So Jesus says, he who overcomes and he who keeps my deeds until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations. Now notice this. And he, this is the overcomer in Jesus, shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of the potter are broken to pieces, as I also have received authority from my Father. Now, this is very similar language to Revelation 19:15, which was also making reference to Psalm 2:9. So what we have here is incredible. We've already seen in Revelation 12:5 and in Revelation 19:15 that Jesus is the one who's going to fulfill the Psalm 2, 8, and 9 reign of the Messiah over the nations on earth, ruling over everything at that particular time with a rod of iron. And now Jesus is taking Psalm 2:9, which is about him, and saying, hey, I'm going to share this reign with those who are the overcomers. So this is one of these great passages that indicate that the saints will reign with Jesus when he reigns in his kingdom. So when Jesus comes again, not only will he reign over the nations, but he will delegate it such that those who are the overcomers and his followers in the sage will also rule as well. But very significantly, again, we are seeing that there is another reference to Psalm 2:9 in the New Testament, in this case in Revelation 2, verses 26 to 27. And again, the shall rule is future. And we are seeing that this reign of the saints is a future thing. So let's just tie it all together as we've done our discussion of Psalm 2:9, really in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But what are some of the implications that we see here? Well, first of all, Psalm 2:9 declares that the Messiah is destined to rule the nations of the earth with a rod of iron. Make sure you catch all those elements there. God's Messiah, his anointed one, is destined to rule the nations of the earth, on the earth, and then it's with a dominating rod of iron reign, something that we still believe is future. And then Revelation 12:5 tells us that Jesus is the one who is destined to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Explicitly told that in Revelation 12:5. And then in Revelation 19:15, this verse places this rule with a rod of iron at Jesus' second coming, which is extremely significant. The taking the possession of the earth and the reigning over the nations with a rod of iron, that occurs at the second coming of Christ, where Jesus, he will rule them with a rod of iron. And then in Revelation 2, 26 to 27, as it also alludes to, or quotes Psalm 2:9, we see that Jesus's people, the overcomers, the ones who are in him, they will rule the nations with a rod of iron in the future when Jesus reigns. So when you put that all together, we're seeing some pretty strong intertextual connections. Psalm 2, 8, and 9, the Messiah is going to reign over the nations and over the earth. That was predicted in Genesis 49:10. It was predicted in Numbers 24:17 to 18. And then it's projected to occur with future events according to Revelation 12:5 and Revelation 19:15, and then Revelation 2:26 to 27. So anyway, I believe, therefore, that Psalm 2:8-9 is going to be fulfilled at the second coming of Christ. And we also see great continuity in Scripture, that what was talked about in Genesis is the same message in Numbers, is the same message in Psalm 2, is the same message in the very last book of the Bible. So there's great continuity between Old Testament expectation and New Testament fulfillment. And that's true for Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9, and the second coming of Jesus. I hope our little study was helpful of Psalm 2, and we'll see you later. Take care.